What makes a man a man? Is it chromosomes? Is it anatomical parts? Is it just wishing they were a man? I'm a man, look at me, surprise. What is it that makes them a man? People are confused today about what men are and what women are. And these are basic questions, but a lot of really smart people can't really answer them. They just can't. It's kind of confusing everybody, and it's confusing a lot of men. My question really comes down to what makes a male a man? And that's what we want to look at. All males are born male, but are they really men? Have they really moved into that sphere of being a man? Have they really defined themselves as a man? Or are they just male? There's a lot of males out there, but a lot of them really aren't men. And so I'm using the man or Muppet illustration to kind of show us what is a man. What is it to be a man, or are we just male? You see, we have a choice to be a man or to be a Muppet. I call a male who doesn't act like a man a Muppet, because that's how he's acting. He's not really being a real man. He may be male, but he's not being a man. They're parroting other people, and they're being controlled by others. So let's find out what makes you a man today and not a Muppet, because you don't want to be a Muppet. You want to be a man. So let's jump in.
Welcome to the Confident Man Podcast, empowering men with the confidence they need to live their adventure. Now, here is your host, David Maxwell.
Hey guys, welcome to the Confident Man Podcast. I'm so glad you joined me here today, and I'm so glad you are making the choice to be a better man. So the question today is, are you a man or are you a Muppet? And yes, it is part 2, and it's from a movie in 2011, the Muppet movie that came out. Jason Segel, Amy Adams were in it. And there was a song that I talked a lot about last week, and it was in it called Am I a Man or a Muppet? Great song. In fact, it won an Academy Award, which is kind of crazy. But it asks a really good question. And here's some of the lyrics from the song that I think will help us kind of think through today's show. It says, I reflect on my reflection, and I ask myself the question, what's the right direction to go? I don't know. I look into these eyes and I don't recognize the one I see inside. It's time for me to decide. Those are actually pretty powerful lyrics for a Muppet movie, because I think it states how a lot of men feel today. They just do. What direction do I go? Who am I on the inside? If a lot of men were honest, those are questions they ask all the time, especially a lot of young men today. They don't know who they are. They don't know where they're going. But the key line is at the end. It says, it's time for me to decide. The truth is, often men don't decide, but they need to decide. When men say, I don't know who I am, it's because they haven't decided who they're going to be. They think it's something that will be revealed to them, and it's not. It's something that they discover. That's what they have to do. And being a man is starting that journey of discovery of who you're going to be. You move, you do something, you pick a direction, and you go. You don't wait around till everything is perfect and safe. Nothing is safe today. But you can't have an adventure in the realm of safety. If you want to be a man, you've got to live your own ultimate adventure. And that means you're not always going to be safe. It doesn't mean you're going to do everything right. But you know what? It's your adventure. And that's what men do. And men are missing a sense of adventure with their own lives. They just are. So we have to choose who we are as men. The power is in our choice. It really is. Choice sets you in the right direction. Now, it's going to change over the years, and you may end up somewhere completely different from where you thought you were going to be. But the key is that you started choosing and you started moving in a direction. So I want to give you 3 areas that you must make choices in. You have to understand that if you want to be a man and not a Muppet, you got to make these choices. You got to know that a man is an individual, a man is in charge, and a man is influential. The first thing we want to talk about is how every man is an individual. That's what a man is. A man is an individual. Last week, we talked about how a Muppet is a caricature. He's pretend. They're not real. They're a fabrication. And a lot of men are living their lives as fabrications. That's how they're living every day. They're playing a part. And that really doesn't make them a man. It makes them a caricature. It makes them a Muppet because they don't know who they are. But every man at his foundation should be an individual. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean to be an individual? Well, one of the things is you're free to think. It's important to know that as a man, you're free to be yourself, to think through things yourself. And that's what men do. They look at everything from that individualist perspective. In other words, as a man, what do I think of this? As a man, how do I feel about this? How do I react to this? That doesn't mean a man isn't a part of groups. He doesn't have similar beliefs to other people. He often will. But it's things that he's done because he's chosen to do it as an individual. He didn't get swept up in groupthink. He didn't get where he's just following somebody else. That's what men who are caricatures do. They're not individuals. You see, when a man joins a group as an individual, he's joining by choice. When a man joins a group as a caricature, he's joining to get acceptance. And that's what we have to understand. A lot of men are living their lives for the acceptance of others. Men who are individuals choose to be around others, but they make the choice. They're willing to go through those things and to come to that decision to join with other people. Men who are Muppets are scared to think for themselves. They just don't do it. They're scared that they're going to hurt other people or let other people down, or they're scared of what other people think of them. So what they do is they don't act as individuals. And we're missing free thinking men in our society today. We just are. A lot of guys don't think free. They just kind of follow what everybody else does. They're not individuals. We need men who are willing to stand even against popular thought or challenge other people's opinions and thinking. Doesn't mean you have to be a jerk, but too many men today are afraid to even ask the question, why? Why do we think this? You're not allowed to think that today for a lot of men. And so a lot of men just go along with the group. They just go along with what other people do and they don't act as individuals. That's why it's so important for us as men to engage our brains and not just passively sit back and accept everything everybody says. That's why men should be reading, debating, growing our thoughts, doing those things. We need men who've wrestled with what we think. We're not intimidated by outside pressure when we've already done the battle inside our mind. When we've already struggled with, okay, what do I think about this? How do I feel about this? When you've done that, then peer pressure doesn't affect you because you've already wrestled. Men who don't know, men who are insecure, they allow peer pressure to change them. It doesn't mean that you can't be persuaded, but it means you're thinking about it. You've made that choice. But if someone's just yelling at you or trying to intimidate you in that way, if you've already done the thinking and the wrestling, it's not going to bother you. You're just going to move on. We need men who think and don't just live in survival mode. When you're in survival mode, you're just focused on making it through the day. You don't have time to meditate and think through things. You don't even slow down enough to think. That's why our busy culture is so dangerous to men, because we're not making that time to think as an individual, to figure things out. Now, another thing that's important as men is that they're willing to change. You see, real men are individuals, yes, but they're also willing to change. They're free thinkers, yes, they think as an individual, but they're willing to change. An individual man is himself, and he knows what he thinks, but he's also open to know what other people think because he knows he doesn't know everything, which means that you have to be willing to change. You have to be willing to find what is truth, what is real. A man who's a real individual isn't afraid of truth and challenges. He's just not, because he wants to find what's best, what's right. And he knows that may be what he thinks, but it could also be what someone else thinks. And that's what an individual man does. He thinks through things. He receives information. He thinks through it. And he goes out with his information and his opinion he can talk through. And it really demands contemplation and thought. And it demands humility. And a lot of guys just don't have that today. They don't do a lot of thinking. They're very full of pride. And so they're not willing to change. They're not willing to learn. But when a man is an authentic individual, he understands, I'm not the center of the universe. But too many guys today think they are. They think they're the center of the universe. So they're not willing to change because they're acting like they're their own God. But those guys really just have a gnawing sense of insecurity, and that drives them to want to be accepted by others. A man who's an individual doesn't let insecurity control him. He tries to find what's the best answer, what's the best thing, what's the truth. Too many men today are hard-headed, they're stubborn because they've let their insecurity drive them. They're not really looking for truth, they're looking to make themselves look good. And an individual man is strong in his stands and his beliefs, but he understands that there's a priority of beliefs. There are some things to be very strong on and you don't move. Like if a man has a belief in God, that's a big area to stand on. And he's usually not going to get pushed off that for anything. But if a man has a belief in what's the best handgun, well, that's not quite as big as a belief in God. So someone could come in and say, hey, I think the SIG is a better gun than a Glock and here's why and yada, yada. And he might convince him of that. It's not as big a deal as the other. And then you may have a belief on what your favorite pair of underwear are. And people say, well, that's not a big deal. Well, to a man, it is a big deal. Every man's got their favorite underwear. But you know what? We're always open. If some guy comes to you and says, this is the greatest pair of underwear I've ever worn in my life, you're willing to take a shot at it because it might be the greatest pair of underwear in your life. And so what we want to do as men is understand that you got to be willing to change. All men have opinions and preferences, and that's what makes them an individual. They don't try to be like other men. You can have mentors, you can have people you learn from, but you're still an individual. You have to make the decisions. You have to choose, and which means a man has to be true to himself. You see, an individual isn't a caricature like a Muppet because he sees himself as unique from every other man. He may have similarities with other men, but he's different. Every man is different. Every one of us is unique, and we should be true to that uniqueness that we are because it's a great thing. Because when you have different men getting together, they all have different ideas, they bring different things to the tables, and it makes every one of us better. We just have to be true to ourselves and who we are. Like, for example, a lot of guys drink coffee, huge coffee drinkers. They get into it. I know guys who roast their own coffee and all that stuff. I'm a tea guy. I do loose leaf tea. I love tea. I just don't like coffee. But I can sit around with those guys while they're drinking a cup of coffee. I can drink a cup of tea. It's who I am. And what we want to do as men is be individuals. Don't be afraid to be who you are because that's the way you were designed. Second thing we want to talk about is being in charge. Being a man instead of a Muppet means you're in charge. A Muppet has a hand inside of him, or he's controlled by someone from the outside. Many men are living their lives controlled by others. They just are. But that's not how we should live as men. We should be in charge of ourselves. We should be men who are willing to walk that road of being in charge of themselves. And you say, well, what does that look like? Well, for one thing, it looks like a man who accepts responsibility. Every man who is in charge of himself is willing to take responsibility for his thoughts and his actions. It means he's willing to do what he has to do, and he's willing to take the responsibility for it. See, we're living in a culture today that just wants to blame everybody, to be a victim. Real men don't act that way. Real men don't act like victims. Real men take responsibility. They look at what they did and they accept consequences, good and bad. You may do something that does great. You may do something that makes you $1 billion. Great. But if you do something that loses $1 billion, you got to take responsibility for that too. Men who are in charge are men who focus on full ownership of themselves, full ownership of their choices. Now, accepting responsibility means understanding we're not going to get everything right. We're not perfect. Accepting responsibility doesn't mean I'm going to make every decision perfect, but it's not being afraid to make a decision. And that's the key part. You're going to make the decision with the best information you have at the time. Hesitancy can cause more damage than making a clear decision. Have you ever been driving behind a hesitant driver? They're scary. I would rather a driver make a decision, even if it's not the best decision, because then I can respond accordingly. But if they hesitate, they start to do one thing and start to do the other, you don't know what to do behind them. And a lot of men are living their life that way. And men who understand responsibility are going to make a decision when the time comes to make a decision. They're not going to hesitate. They're not going to wait till everything is perfect. They're not going to wait till they know everything. They're going to make a decision at the time the decision needs to be made. You see, a lot of guys hold off and they think, well, let me get a little bit more information, a little bit more information. And what they really want to know is this the best decision before they make the decision? There's no way for you to know that. You've got to be realistic. And if you're going to keep waiting to make a decision, it's going to hurt your ability to lead as a man. And a man who's in charge is also a man who gives direction. You see, it's a man who's in charge of himself and he picks a direction to go. A lot of guys today are just sitting and waiting. They're waiting for everything to work out by itself. Well, I hope it works. I hope something works out. In charge men don't wait. They don't sit around. They choose a direction and they start moving. It doesn't mean they just do whatever. They make the best decision at the time. I think this is the best direction for me. And they start going that direction. They start moving. You see, picking a direction doesn't mean you're going to change directions all the time. It means you're picking one way to go and you're moving that way. You see, that's important for men. Too many men are afraid to make a decision. They're afraid to commit to things. So you see guys not getting married. Why? Because they don't want to get married, because they're scared. Well, what if it's not perfect? What if she's not the right one? I want to keep my options open. And that's their excuse to not make a decision. They're scared to pick a direction. A lot of guys do that with jobs. A lot of guys do that just with dating in general. They're scared to commit to someone. They're scared to go out with someone because they're scared, is this the right direction? And the key that you want to understand, that committing to a direction doesn't mean that your direction won't change in the future. You want to keep your options open in some ways, yes, but in a lot of ways, that just takes away from your decision. See, if you get married, but you keep your options open, that's not good. It's not going to be a good marriage. It's not going to last long, and it's going to be a problem. You can keep some options open. Like if you take a job, you can say, hey, I'm going to take this job, but if another job comes along, I may take it. But what it means is you're not going to take away from that job that you're in. You want to give your best to that job. You've said, hey, I'm picking this job. I'm doing this job. I'm going to give it my all. Now, if something else comes along later, fine, but I'm not going to sit here and keep looking and it's going to distract me from the job I have to do. That's what it means to pick a direction. We can't let fear be the biggest influencer in our life, or you'll never make a decision. You'll just keep waiting and waiting and put it off. Men who are in charge of themselves make the decision. They choose a direction in their own life, in their jobs, in everything they do. Men who are in charge also just take action. You see, in charge men are not afraid to take action. When it comes time to move, they move. And we've kind of talked about that already. But it's important to do that today. It's important to know that because a lot of guys just sit back. They won't make a decision. They won't take action. And a lot of guys, what they do is they'll make a decision, then they don't take action. They make the decision in their mind. They think, oh, God, I've made this. I'm going to do it. But then they don't do anything. So you know what? They really haven't taken any action, which means they're not really making the decision. They made the decision to feel good about it, but they're not taking any action, which means they really didn't make the decision. Action is the culmination of a decision. Without action, there's been no decision. There's not, because action always follows a decision. If you're not taking action, you didn't really make a decision. You may pretend you did, but it's not coming out. You see, we don't need to rush decisions. We don't need to say, okay, well, maybe I'll make decisions, maybe not, or I got to make it right now. But sometimes you do. But whenever you make a decision, you need to make it and take action on it. We got to take time to think clearly what's going to happen. But once the decision is made, you take action. You don't hold back. It's like a guy who decides, I'm going to ask this girl out. I'm going to go ask her out. Well, it's not really a real decision until he actually asks her out. There's a lot of guys who talk about it. Every weekend they say, oh, this is the weekend. I'm going to ask her out. I'm going to ask her out. But then they don't. Why? Because they're not taking any action. So they didn't really make the decision. It's a hope. It's kind of a dream they have of asking her out, but they're not really doing it. And too many men are living in that dream state today. They imagine a lot of things. They imagine themselves doing a lot of things, but they're not taking any action. And if you're not taking action, you really didn't make a decision. Now understand, action doesn't mean perfection. It just means movement. Movement brings that feedback, and feedback helps us make better decisions in the future. Your first decision may not be your best decision, but you know what? You'll make the decision, you'll get feedback, then you'll make your second decision, then your third decision. And each time you're going to take action, and the feedback you get from that action is going to help you make better decisions in the future. The truth is, Muppets have someone controlling them. They just do. They're not in charge. And too many men today are letting society control them, letting other people control them, or letting their own fears control them. It's time for us to step up as men and be in charge of ourselves, our decisions, and everything we do. The third thing we want to talk about is being influential. When you think of influential men, who do you think of? Do you think of a relative? Do you think of maybe a friend or some star or a musician or a historical figure? The reality is any of these could be your inspiration, but every one of them was influential. Every man influences others. I don't care who you are as a man, you're going to influence others in your life. At some point in your life, you're going to be an influence on someone else. And the choice we have as men is, are we going to influence them to be like us or to not be like us? And that's the key right there. The most obvious example of this is fathers. Fathers have the most influence on their children for good or for bad. When kids have an involved dad, a loving dad, the majority of them are going to turn out well. They're going to turn out very well adjusted. When kids have an uninvolved or absent father or an abusive father, they're going to get involved in a lot of destructive behaviors. See, I worked with teenagers for 30 years, and I can attest to this. Active, involved dads made a huge difference in their children's life. They were a positive influence. But uninvolved dads were just as influential, just not in the positive way, but in a negative way. It's just the way it was. As men, we influence others by the choices we make and how we live. We just do. You are an influence to other people. Not just our own children, but everyone we come in contact with. We choose how we influence. And that makes us a man and not a Muppet. I'm not saying we're always going to be polite and nice to everyone. There are some times you just can't. But I'm saying we choose how we influence by our attitudes and our actions. Because the truth is, leading means leading. It just does. Leaders can be loving, but they can also be tough. Toughness can be one of the most loving things you can be to someone. We've all had those people who loved us enough to kick us in our butt and say, you need to step it up. You need to be a better man. Those people really did love us. We didn't feel it at the time, but we needed it. You think of people who do the SEAL training. SEAL training is incredibly hard. I do not want to go through that, but I've read about it. You've seen the things. Why do they do that? Because they care about those men. And they want every man who becomes a SEAL to be a man who's not going to quit on his brothers. And that's the whole point of the training. So you know what they're doing? They're actually showing a great amount of influence to these men. And they're influencing them to be the best they can be. They're challenging them to be better. You know why? Because they care about them. They don't want a man who's out on the field to have someone else back off them. They don't want to have someone else drop out. And they're really loving these guys by being so hard on them. Now, the truth is, men are influential. Muppets, they're not influential. Why? They're comic relief. We talked about that last week, but too many men have allowed themselves to be put into that comic relief category. But that's a lie. You're not just comic relief. Even if you try to be, you're being an influence. Every man influences others. You say, I'm not hurting anybody with my choices, Dave. I'm just hurting me. I'm not hurting anyone else. That's a lie. You're influencing others by your choices. Even if your choices are bad, even if you live completely by yourself, who you work with, who you hang around, whoever your family is, they're influenced by your choices. Now, they can be influenced for good or for bad, and that's up to you. So what we have to do as men is we have to quit lying to ourselves. Our lives matter as men. We make a difference. We need to quit playing games and take up our role as leaders. Every man's a leader. He just is. You lead yourself and you lead others. There's no getting out of that. You can say, well, I don't want to be a leader. I'm sorry. You're a man. It's who you are. You choose how you lead. You choose how you're going to be an influence, but you make that choice. As men have quit leading themselves, they've kind of dropped out of their influence, so they think. Look at what's happened to society. As men have become less a part of people's lives, as men have backed out of their obligations as dads and as husbands, look at what's happened to our society. Look how the influence has gone in a negative direction. Look how many young people today are raised without a dad. Look how many criminals in prison are there because they didn't have a dad. You say, are you just blaming men? Yes, I am. I am blaming men because we have to take our role. We have to be an influence. You don't want to be a man who influences to the negative. You want to quit being a man who's controlled by others. You want to quit being a man who's only comic relief like a Muppet. You want to quit being a man who just makes excuses. Your influence on others is completely based on you. It's completely based on what you do. Now, you may have been hurt in the past. You may have. You may have made some bad choices in the past. Well, guess what? Join the club. Every man has. But that doesn't mean he has to stop. It doesn't mean he has to quit. It doesn't mean he has to give up being an influence. It's time for us to suck it up and be a man. No one's going to do it for you. The person you have to start with is you. Your greatest influence begins with you influencing yourself. That's what men do. They get themselves up and they get themselves moving. You have to influence yourself to start making good choices. You've got to quit sucking at life and be the man you were designed to be. That's what men do. Muppets can't do it, but men can, and you can. All right, guys, closing out the show, we want to come into the end of it and ask that question, are you a man or are you a Muppet? And you know, the funny thing about it, it's a funny song, it's a funny movie, you should go watch it. But really, it's all about us making that choice. Every day, we have the choice to be a man or to be a Muppet. And you know what? You've got to make it every day. You've got to make it a bunch of times every day. It's not an easy thing, but we're men. It's what we do. Now, remember what a Muppet is. A Muppet is a caricature. He's not real. He's kind of a character that somebody plays. He's an actor. He puts a mask on. He looks like somebody else. A Muppet is controlled. Someone's hand is literally controlling them, or they're being controlled through CG or whatever. There's ways they're being controlled. And a lot of men today, they're being controlled. And also, Muppets are comic relief. We laugh at them. That's why we like Muppets. They're funny. We don't look at them for serious stuff, but we don't want to be that way as men. Can we be funny? Yes, but we want to be men and not Muppets. We don't want to just be seen as comic relief. Now, what is a man? If you're going to be a man, you've got to be an individual. You've got to know who you are. You've got to know what you're about. You got to quit just surviving in life, and you've got to step up and say, okay, who am I? What am I going to be? And then you got to be in charge. A man has to be someone who's not afraid to make decisions, not afraid to think through things and pick directions. That's what a man is who's in charge of himself does. A man who's in charge of himself picks that direction, picks a way to go. And then you've got to choose how you're going to be influential. Every man is influential, but you choose if you're going to be an influence for good or if you're going to be an influence for bad. So the decision is yours. You can make excuses. You can blame, but in the end, each of us is going to stand before God and have to give an account for what kind of man we were. We choose to be a man who's involved or a man who sits on the sideline. We choose to be a man who just kind of pulls back from life or a man who lives his ultimate adventure. I want to challenge you to start moving. Start making a difference today. Make that decision right now. Make a decision 10 minutes from now. Make a decision tonight. Make the decision tomorrow to be a man and not a Muppet. We need you to be the man you were designed to be.
You've been listening to the Confident Man Podcast. Click subscribe so you don't miss a future episode. You can connect with David on Facebook and Instagram at David the Maxwell. find resources to help you as a man at theconfidentman.me. That's theconfidentman.me.